For too many years, too many men have been getting away with behaving inappropriately towards women, in social settings and in the workplace. But some recent, very high-profile cases have now begun to shine a spotlight on sexual harassment as never before. And there's a new law in the province of Ontario dealing with this subject as well. Lawyer Janice Rubin is co-founder and co-managing partner at Rubin Thomlinson, and she joins us now for more. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to urge that you just get comfy for a second, because I'm going to go through a bit of a rogues gallery of examples here just to set up our discussion.
Okay.
Sheldon, if you would, bring these up. Here's the checklist here. There was the Dalhousie University Dentistry Gentlemen's Club Facebook group, which included sexually explicit posts, a discussion of using chloroform on women, and voting on which woman they'd like to have, quote-unquote, hate sex with. The University of Ottawa hockey team suspended its men's hockey program after allegations of sexual assault came to the university's attention. There was the RCMP commissioner delivering an abject apology to female officers and employees who were subjected to alleged incidents of bullying, discrimination, and harassment dating back 42 years. At RMC, the Royal Military College in Kingston, nearly a dozen women have complained about sexual harassment on campus. There is an apparent agreement at the Toronto Star between management and the union there to investigate widespread claims of managers creating a sexually toxic atmosphere at the paper. There is an ongoing hearing at the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal of sexual harassment at the Toronto Police Service. There was, Janice Rubin, your own investigation into the post-Gomeshi CBC after all of the things the former Q host said and did came to light, and we haven't even mentioned the President-elect of the United States yet. In any event, my hunch is none of these things would have or might have come to light a decade ago, but they are now. How come? What's happening?
They are now. I think there are a couple things. One is that, your hall of shame, you could also say, are examples of behavior that is still deeply ingrained in our society, deeply ingrained in our workplace relationships, deeply ingrained, alas, in our personal and social relationships. So that's still there. That hasn't changed. But I think at the same time, there is an openness. There's a window open, if you like, where things, I'm mixing my metaphors, but things are bubbling up to the surface. And there is, I think, increased public attention, increased legal attention to these types of problems. So you've got a problem and you've got more attention being paid to it and more reaction to the problem from legal decision makers. And for that matter, the court of public opinion in a lot of these cases.
What role do you think more women in higher ranking positions in society has to do with all of this?
I think it has something to do with it. I think that if you speak to many, many women, and many women have had the experience of being sexually harassed. The recent statistics are 1 out of 3. If you put somebody who's had that experience in a place where they're making decisions about what to do, I think they bring their own sensitivity to it. Plus, there are lots and lots of men who are sympathetic to this issue, who are allies. So I think things are shifting a little bit from that perspective.
I mentioned in the intro that since last September, we've got a new law in place now in the province of Ontario,
right.
The Sexual Violence and Harassment Action Plan Act. What does that do?
Well, for purposes of the workplace, it does a bunch of different things, but as an employment lawyer, as a workplace investigator, I'm interested in what it does for the workplace. So it does a couple things. One is it expands the definition of workplace harassment to make it absolutely clear that workplace harassment under the Occupational Health and Safety Act includes sexual harassment, number one. Most importantly, for the first time in Canada, it creates a very, very clear statutory obligation on the part of employers to investigate not only a formal complaint of workplace harassment, here, Steve, you are the HR person and I'm making a complaint, but also incidents, sort of sub-complaint of workplace harassment. And what that focuses on is an awareness that the employer has that there is something that's gone off in the workplace in terms of workplace harassment. So the employer has to investigate, and if the employer doesn't investigate or doesn't conduct an investigation that is deemed to be appropriate in the circumstances, that's the language right from the bill, the Ministry of Labour has the power to order a third party to come in and do that investigation at the employer's expense.
How often does that happen?
Well, it's just come on the books as of September, so I don't know. Too new to say, but it has real teeth.
How capable do you think our employers and our businesses are in doing just what you described?
Some are. Some are and some aren't. It's a real mixed bag. There are lots of very, I think, sophisticated institutions out there who are doing a reasonably good job of it. But you know, the case law has now many examples of employers who completely screw it up, who make mistakes. Either they don't respond or the mechanism of responding is fundamentally flawed.
What is your legal specialty?
My legal specialty? Well, I'm an employment lawyer. I've been an employment lawyer for almost all of the 25 years that I've practiced. But over the last 10, 15 years or so, my practice has shifted, and so that now I do nothing but act as a neutral, as a workplace investigator. And in fact, this is not only my specialty, but of the 13 lawyers at our firm, about half of us do nothing but that.
On what issue in particular?
On anything involving the workplace, but for me, primarily, it's workplace harassment.
Did your kind of job exist 20 years ago?
My kind of job did not exist 20 years ago.
So what does that say?
Well, that says to me a couple of things. One is that the law demands this, but also there are enough employers out there that want to do the right thing, that are concerned about complaints and now incidents of workplace harassment, that they want to have somebody like me come in from outside, conduct an investigation, and tell them what's going on. I will tell you that sometimes they don't like the message I have to tell them.
I want everybody to know that you and I talked on the phone well before we did this interview.
We did.
And therefore, I have your permission to follow the following line of questioning. I'm not just sort of fishing here or blue skying, because this is not an academic subject for you. You told me over the phone that you have been sexually harassed in the workplace, yes?
Yes, but in that respect, I mean, the interview is not about my experiences per se, but I mentioned that to you in our phone call because I think that's typical of many women, of many women. I don't think I'm atypical, and if anything, I am more immune, if you like, to the effects of sexual harassment. English is my first language. I'm not an immigrant. I'm educated. I'm by nature assertive.
And yet.
And yet.
Can I ask you a little bit more about this?
Sure.
When did it happen?
So I was 17 years old. It happened, as a matter of fact, just a few blocks from here. We're sitting in downtown Toronto, and I was working. I was working at a little Ma and Pa shop, a gourmet food shop. I needed the job, and Ma was out. Pa and I were alone in the store, and I was cleaning something, and Pa came up behind me and did as I recall, a two-handed complete bum grab and said something quite profane and disgusting, the exact nature of which I can't remember.
And you're a 17-year-old kid who needs a job, so
Correct.
How did you respond?
Well, I froze. And I remember that the first thought that went through my mind was that it had been my fault because I'd gone to work without a slip on that day, and I was wearing sort of a long Indian print skirt, and I thought perhaps that it had been my fault. But then I thought it was my fault. I was stunned. The next morning, though, I was so appalled that I actually complained to Ma. I went and I complained to her.
And what happened then?
She fired me.
She fired you?
She did fire me.
Do you know whether she had a word with Pa?
I would imagine she had a word with Pa, and who knows, she may have fired him along the way too. I don't know. But, it's funny because there I was at 17, and I could never have fast forwarded my life 36 years from that moment, and it was pivotal for me. I didn't recognize it at the time, but it was pivotal for me because when I talk to women, mostly women, although there are men who are sexually harassed in the workplace too, I remember that incident and I remember how I felt.
If that happened today,
right,
how would you handle it differently today?
For me?
Yeah. Or let me put it even differently. I imagine you probably got a kid around that age.
Yeah, my daughter's a little younger than me, than I was at that time.
But if that had happened to her at this day and age, how would you want her or hope that she would handle it?
Well, I would hope that she would come and talk to me. I didn't tell my parents at the time. I think that, it's difficult in a small organization. I spoke to the boss. The boss promptly fired me. Probably we would, she has the benefit of having a mother as a lawyer. We would sue them. We'd bring a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal. And, it was a grab, and it took me many years, well into my legal career, to realize that not only was that a form of harassment, but it was an assault. So, would I encourage my daughter to go to the police under those circumstances? I'm not sure. But I certainly, she has been raised, as has been my boys, that type of behavior is completely inappropriate.
Was that the only incident over your professional life?
Oh, well, like many women, there have been other occasions, but that was the most pronounced.
Is there, in your experience, a particular demographic of men who just simply don't get this?
I'm not sure if it's a particular, well, perhaps 70-year-old men who run for the President of the United States demographic. Is there
a demographic of one, though.
That's a demographic of one. Yeah. I would say that the most pronounced demographic I see in my practice are men who make a lot of money. Sort of north of $500,000, I would say. We sort of in our world call it north of stupid. That's the line. That there's something about that level of income that empowers people to behave in ways that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise.
Makes you feel entitled.
Makes you feel entitled. Makes you feel that the normal rules don't apply to you.
Can we understand how this happens? Because I presume some of it is obviously what you just described, but is some of it boys are not being raised properly to be respectful?
I think that's part of it. I think we also see examples in our culture of people behaving this way and who are not held accountable. So it's some form of license. I mean, that is for me, my deep fear about, or one of my fears about, President-elect Trump, as far as that particular issue is concerned. There seems to be no consequences, that this behavior, on the assumption that it's true, is not immediately disqualifying for a leadership role. So I think there is that. And I also think within some institutions there is an equation made that it can be well known that a person has behaved badly. It can be well known. It can be a completely, the world's most open secret. And yet that person is considered to be irreplaceable, usually wrongly, but irreplaceable. They're so important. They generate so much revenue.
You sound like you're talking about a former radio host here.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking
specific. Yeah.
No, I'm talking generally what I have observed in the work that we do.
But let me go back to that example you gave of yourself as a 17-year-old.
Right.
Is there something about the way girls and women are raised to make them think, I shouldn't say anything about this?
It is a societal phenomena that victims of sexual harassment don't report. We know that only a small percentage of people who experience this behavior ever report. I'm not sure if it's so much the way women are raised. I think it's messages we get from the culture that it's our fault, that we should be ashamed, that we lie, that we won't be believed. I mean, these are all beliefs that are baked in thoroughly to our culture. Plus a legitimate fear that if we come forward, we will be fired, we will be punished, we will be subject to some form of reprisal. That's not an irrational fear. That happens all the time. So, I hope with the Hall of Shame list that you've got, with that shift, I think that is going on in society now, that women will feel more emboldened coming forward, and that especially is if you are part of a group, if there's a group of you that are experiencing the same behavior. You mentioned the RCMP as an example. There you see the power of the group that can really decrease the vulnerability of that one person who's coming forward.
I wonder where the burden lies here, because I gather often when women come forward and complain, they're told, well, you've just simply misinterpreted what this man's intentions were. And I wonder if the burden ought to be on the woman to understand what's going on in that situation, or is the burden on the man to make sure that his actions are understood appropriately?
Well, so there's the burden. There's the burden between the two people. In fact, it's the actor, not the actee, if you like. The actor is to behave in a way that is not to be unwelcome, and not to be sort of reasonably, objectively understood to be unwelcome. So the line between the two people is well before me saying, you, Steve, stop it. It's you have to decide whether objectively would this particular action be unwelcome? But then there's also the onus on the employer. The employer has an obligation to ensure that the workplace is free from discrimination. Sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination and harassment. So the employer plays an enormous role in this whole thing too. So going back to the language of Bill 132, complaints, formal complaint, I tell you, but incidents. And lots of times employers have some awareness, it may not be that formal complaint, but have some awareness that there's something going on. And Bill 132 is a prompt for them to act.
I want to ask you about sort of the other side of this coin, which is whether there's a part of you that's at all concerned that some of this may be an overreaction to, how do you want to call it? Like kind of legitimate flirtation that goes on in the workplace all the time that's sort of relatively harmless, and that men will interpret this as the heavy hammer coming down. It will therefore result in less free speech, less team spirit, less camaraderie in the workplace, all of those things. You know what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, but I say no. I say no.
You don't buy it?
No, I don't buy it. There's still lots of room for friendship in workplaces. There's still lots of room for humor in workplace. There certainly is room for relationships to develop, admittedly on a consensual basis. There's lots of room for that. We're talking about stuff that goes way beyond that. Instances certainly in the work that we've done where people are grabbed, they are groped, they are relentlessly propositioned, they are sexually objectified. There's a case that I recall from a number of years ago, which continues to haunt me. A trans woman whose colleague refused to call her by her name, relentlessly mocked her for her appearance, for her manner of speech, called her it. This is way beyond.
Cruel.
I mean, that's cruel.
Yeah.
That's also a form of sexual harassment. It's way beyond those kinds of things that you're describing.
But look, and I'm not pretending to speak on behalf of all men here, but there are going to be some men who will say, look, I was just harmlessly flirting, and now I've got this complaint in front of the Human Rights Tribunal, and she misinterpreted the whole thing and exaggerated it all out of proportion. Now, it's possible that could happen going forward, right?
Yeah, for sure. It is possible. It is possible for that coming forward, or going forward. But the cases that we see that employers and other institutions are really concerned about is not the harmless flirt, not the one-off where somebody said, "Listen, I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I apologize," and people move on. It's the pattern of behavior that is truly egregious, that is totally inappropriate in the workplace.
In which case, in our last couple of minutes here, can you give us some advice on sort of how we get from here to there? If we want to have a workplace where people don't have to worry about being sexually harassed or intimidated or, made to feel small, how do we get there?
Yeah. So, I think there's a bunch of things that we could call into play. The first is for leaders of organizations is to set the tone themselves, to model the behavior that they want to see from their colleagues. Number one. Number two, as part of that, be very clear what the standard of behavior is. We're tempted to believe because we behave in certain ways that everybody comes to the workplace and they're going to be nice and they're going to be polite and they're going to keep their hands to themselves and not grab anybody's bum or anything like that. That's just simply not the case. So leaders and managers, HR people really have to be clear about setting the standard of behavior. And then holding people accountable to this standard of behavior and not giving people free passes because they happen to be important. And then the other thing that I would say is that what we know about when you marry what we know about how frequently sexual harassment occurs with the fact that these incidents are underreported, I think employers need to rethink the idea of just sitting there waiting for the formal complaint to come to them. And even with incidents, that's an awareness that comes to them. What we're suggesting to the organizations that we work with is to shift the paradigm and ask. Ask your employees about the experiences that they're having at work.
Get proactive.
Get proactive. Ask them. And every time we have been involved in a process where we have been asking employees of an institution, we have found things that institution did not know about. So a few ideas.
And your firsthand experience at Mother Corp is an example of that.
Well, I won't get into that.
You won't get into that. Okay, I don't mean to take you down that road anyway. Thanks a lot for coming into TVO tonight, giving us the 411
Pleasure.
on this. Janice Rubin, thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.